it was obviously very easy for the group to handle one of those tennis balls. Well, although for that group it wasn't necessarily as great. For most groups of 6 people who are handing a tennis ball in succession and coming back, it's very easy to hand one. Add 2, gets a little more difficult. And obviously once we had like 6 or 7, they were flying everywhere into the audience and stuff like that. And that's some of the difficulty that people have with executive functioning. Some people can handle the 1 ball. Some people can handle 2. As you get into the 3, 4, 5, 6, it gets more and more difficult. And it depends on where you are, where your brain is, as to how many of those tennis balls you can handle. With that, I'd like to introduce our panel, if we can, starting with Dr. Christine Berry. She is a pediatric neuropsychologist over at University Hospitals. Round of applause, please. Dr. Michael Manis, he's the head of the Center for Pediatric Behavior Health over at the Cleveland Clinic. Lee Achkar.
Yes.
I had to ask her how to say that. She is a parent of a son who has ADHD.
Yes.
Jason Culp, he's the head of the upper school over at Lawrence School. And Michael Kaplan, who is a student over at Notre Dame College, and he's about to graduate in about 2 weeks. Start with Dr. Berry. When it comes to executive functioning, when it comes to organizational skills, what do you see in your practice and how do you try to help people out?
Okay. I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist, so I've spent a lot of my career evaluating children and adolescents with executive functioning weaknesses as part of the neuropsych evaluation. So I spend a large amount of time not only evaluating executive functioning skills, but also coming up with interventions based on those strengths and weaknesses. Are you all familiar with what we mean by executive functioning skills? Okay, maybe do you want me to start there?
That would be great. Yeah.
Okay, so think of executive functioning skills as executive functioning is kind of an umbrella term under which multiple cognitive processes fall. And those, as you saw with our nice group of volunteers up here, things that are involved in executive functioning are things like planning and goal setting, working memory, sustained attention, ability to initiate, ability to inhibit one's impulses, ability to switch sets mentally, do multiple processes at one time. And so as a neuropsychologist, we tend to look at all of those areas and come up with strengths and weaknesses on how to help the kids.
Dr. Manis.
Executive functions are a core component of ADHD, except nobody knows it yet. And the nature of ADHD is a difference between actually 2 kinds of attention, and we don't acknowledge typically those 2 kinds of attention. We've typically looked at ADHD as being a medical disorder, as there's something wrong with somebody. If you consider how the ADHD brain works, that model is not very empowering. And if anybody's worked with a teenager, for example, who is told they have ADHD, the automatic interpretation is, I don't. So in a very important way, it's useful to look at ADHD as the difference between 2 kinds of attention. One kind of attention is the kind of attention we might call fascination. Fascination has specific areas of the brain that light up when we're doing something really interesting. The technical name for it is the default mode network, but let's just call it fascination. Everybody loves to be in fascination. And if we've chosen our careers properly or appropriately and serendipitously, we're doing something we love with our career. But there's another kind of attention that will be with us all of our lives. It's the kind of attention called directed attention. It's also called effortful attention. It's also called top-down attention. You get the idea. It requires effort to use. So when we have to scrub the bathrooms, do our taxes, when we have to do a task that is imposed on us, we use directed attention. In the ADHD brain, directed attention networks don't send strong signals. So you find a person drifting off into fascination with directed attention, pulling it back. And pretty soon, directed attention gets depleted. Already, it's not quite sending as strong signals anyway, so it has to be used more and more. So the whole point is, how do you manage directed attention? And that's what the executive functions are about.
Lee, for a parent, is the frustration with the child, the doctors, the school, how do you deal with all those things?
All of it. All of it is true. I actually have something where we're talking about attention. I wanted to show you what it's like to have a child with attention deficit disorder. I have 2 children. One of them is a daughter who is a goody two shoes and just, so we're going out, 3 of us, my daughter, my son, and I. And I tell them, it's chilly, go and get a jacket from your room. This is my daughter. In her room, down comes with the jacket. This is how my son did it. For those of you who might not be able to see, he starts out here, and then there's the cat, and all of a sudden I hear the cat screeching, and he's, Mom, is it really true they really land on all 4s when you throw them? Cat hates him, by the way. Then he finally lets the cat go, or maybe she scratched him. Then there was a dog. Oh, well, the ball and the dog, now we're chasing the dog up and down the hallway with the dog. And I'm calling, Chris, please, we gotta go. Oh, okay. Except he decided to stop by the den to check out the game score, because some game is on, and he's, of course, interested in 48 different things at the same time. So he's checking out the game score. Then he saw my husband, his dad in the master bedroom. He went in there, well, Dad, they're talking about the game. I'm still calling, Chris, where are you? Go to your room. Okay, so he goes to his room, but he's got fish in his room. So he feeds the fish. And I decided to put the return path in a different color, because otherwise it would be too confusing visually. So he comes down, he stops by the TV room again just to check the game scores again. And then he comes down, and I say, where's your jacket? And he goes, jacket? Oh, jacket. At this point, I say, stop, stay where you are, I'll go get the jacket. Because we would be going through this all over again. So, as a parent, I think that you have to be ready for that. You have to have some coping skills for yourself for that, so that you don't get yourself too frustrated. And realize that your child's behavior is going to be very unpredictable. I had brought this to, I said, this is one of my kaleidoscopes. This is the other. This child is never the same from day to day. Getting his attention, the directed attention, is very difficult. The fascination it's fantastic how that works, because this kid who goes like that to get his jacket can also sit and watch TV for 3 hours. Or when he was little, he used to play with cars and line them up. And he was able to pay attention for a long period of time. And so I think that as we help our high schoolers who are there, and whether you're a parent or a teacher, there are going to be some subjects that fascinate them and they will do really well. There are going to be others that they don't really care about, and it's going to be very difficult to focus them. And so, I would suggest that speak in bullet points and pick your battles. Pick your battles. My son is in college now. Well, he did really, really well in high school. In college now, he's on his own, so he's making decisions a little bit differently. He decided that all the things that are his major, he wants straight A's in. Awesome. All the things that are not in his major, like biology and Spanish, he doesn't care if he gets a C or even a D. He tells me, D for diploma, okay? I'm gonna get through this. And I thought, he's so smart. He really is, and that's the other key point, is that a lot of these kids, as they're first realizing that they have these kinds of issues, they think that they're not smart, and a lot will depend on their environment, both at home, with the family, and with the teachers, whether or not they understand that they really are smart. And they can do a lot. So I was really frustrated. I was like, he's so smart. In fact, sometimes he's brighter than my daughter, who has 2 science degrees. but he just doesn't care about those things. And you know what? I'm okay with it. It makes life a whole lot easier. So pick your battles. Help them to choose a career where they can really have that high level of fascination, and they will do really well because they don't grow out of it. I worked for a man who was 60 years old, and he had ADHD, and he was a great boss, but meetings were always like this, and wherever we were going, we just arrived there, and he was already planning the trip back. There was a lot to process. There's a lot in how you have to get yourself ready in your own mind when you are dealing with a person like that. But it can be done. It can be done.
Jason, Lee mentioned some of the things when it comes to education. How do you help focus a student who may have some organizational skills, some executive function skills, or lack of, to still do what they're doing in the fascination area, but also bring them up in the areas that they may not care about?
Sure. It's been my privilege to work with students for the last 10 years who struggle with executive function challenges. And the way we attempt to view that is that this is not so much about challenge or deficit or dysfunction, but really simply a learning difference. It's a difference in how students process information that's coming in and how they orient themselves in space and how they use their time and materials. And so it's different than other folks. And it requires scaffolded, structured systems over time, consistent across situations and circumstances that allow them to begin to develop those skills at the level that they can, and at least to see that with supports they can be successful. Because one of the things that I think is a struggle for students and families with with differences in executive function is that there may often be a view that because students are disorganized, they can't find the coat, they don't know where the backpack is. I did my homework, it's not in my backpack. That whole situation that you're all very familiar with may feel to you as parents as though it is an intentional situation, that they are completely unaware of how those challenges affect you, affect the family, affect their teachers, affect their performance in school. When in fact, working with students over these many years, I see the distress it causes students because they know. They know they can't find it. They know they did it and don't know where it is. They know they should have had those things turned in. They know they should have communicated with you about an important event and didn't. So it does cause that distress. So I hope one of the messages you'll be able to take away tonight is that as difficult and frustrating as it is, and I speak from experience with a 10-year-old at home who never knows where his coat is, they do understand that they're struggling and they benefit from your patience and support.
We're very fortunate to have Michael here because he has struggled through this himself. He's learned from it. He's been able to take steps to kind of help him and help your particular situation. Talk a little bit maybe about your background and how you were able to get through some of these things.
I was diagnosed with ADHD in 2nd or 3rd grade, so fairly early. And just from the beginning, school was a struggle. Whether it was, okay, I have to read, these 2 chapters tonight, and I get 3 pages in, and oh, that book over there looks really interesting, or oh, the dog's more interesting, and 20 minutes later, or half hour later, I still haven't done the chapters. And I went through several different schools, and there are a lot of things that a teacher may do because they don't really understand how ADHD works, and they'll be trying to help, but it can really have serious negative effects. When I was in 4th grade, my teachers didn't understand how to deal with my ADHD, and their solution was to exempt me from homework for that year. Now, at first glance, you might say, oh, well, that's cool, I have no homework. But that created in me a feeling of, well, I'm not smart enough to do the homework. And a lot of times that does happen, but what I've learned is really it's the opposite. People with ADD, like some of the other panelists have said, they're able to hold interest in something for a longer period of time, assuming that thing interests them, for a longer period of time than someone without ADHD. So, like Dr. Mano said, if they can find something that interests them for a job, they're going to be able to push themselves further and harder than someone without ADHD. Also, if you think about people with ADHD, their mind is racing. So, I knew people growing up who thought, oh, well, it takes him longer to do his work. He must function slower or think slower. Really, it's the opposite. It takes me longer to do my work because while I'm thinking about this work, I'm also thinking about 30 other things. And I've really learned that if managed appropriately, it's certainly something that can be overcome. And that's not to say it'll disappear completely. Somebody referenced Mel Levine earlier, and he has done a lot to promote people with different thinking styles. About 10 years ago at Notre Dame College, he was set to give a presentation. Now, he himself suffered from ADHD, and he got lost on his way from the airport to Notre Dame. So he decided to turn around and go home. He missed the whole thing. So it's not something that you'll completely overcome, but you can certainly learn to deal with it to the point that it doesn't adversely affect your life. And I'm hoping to share some of the things that I've learned that have helped me overcome it so that other people may do the same.
Thank you, Brooke. We're going to get to your questions probably in the next 10 or 15 minutes, so if you have a question that you would like the panel to answer, make sure you're writing that down, and our people will pick those up probably in the next 10 minutes or so we're able to go with those. We're lucky to have Tree of Knowledge as our sponsor. They talked to us right before, and they said they'd done a survey with their teachers and instructors at the end of the year, and the instructors had said, this is the most important thing we need to help kids with. Getting them organized, getting their executive function skills to work, helping them so that they can, function properly on their own if they're in college, things of that. As an adult, you want the best for your kids as an adult. You want them to be able to do that. Dr. Berry, when it comes to behavior and maybe versus the inner workings of the brain, for some people it may be difficult to say, my child, they're going to grow into this, or they're going to grow out of whatever they're doing. They're going to be able to get on with their own, no problem. Do you need the professional help? Do you need a diagnosis, or are there other things you can do to help your child out?
I think it really depends on the child. I think that, clearly there are a lot of individuals out there with executive functioning weaknesses that don't necessarily meet diagnostic criteria for ADHD or another disorder. There are a lot of disorders out there that have executive functioning weaknesses as part of those, but in general, I would always recommend that the parent look very specifically at what the executive functioning weaknesses are, look at your child's strengths and weaknesses, try to build on those strengths like we've talked about already, and if you identify a specific weakness in executive functioning, try to address that by breaking it down and teaching the child specific organizational strategies. Using visual checklists are usually very beneficial for the children, and see if that works. If you can break tasks down, identify where the process is falling down. Is it an initiation? Is it that your child or adolescent or young adult has difficulty starting a task? Very frequently I see that because individuals just get so overwhelmed with so much coming in at one time, they need help with how to start. I just worked with a little girl the other day who's brilliant, a gifted child who is struggling in school because she's really having a difficult time taking tests. And what she said to me is, Dr. Berry, I know the information. If my teachers could just ask me and let me answer verbally, I would do very well. But when I go to take the test, I skip a question, and that throws me off. I circle the wrong answer in the little bubble test. Or I just forget a detail, or I begin to get distracted by my internal thoughts. So we just came up with other ways of taking tests for her and really getting people to understand that it really is a weakness and it's not intentional.
Jason, will schools do that? Will schools help out? I mean, obviously there are teachers who have 25, 30 kids in their classroom if they're at a public school, and they're trying to handle all these students at once. They have IEPs, they have these 504s, but they can't always get to them probably as the best that the child needs. So how do you work with a school as a parent to make sure that they're helping your child do the best they can and getting those accommodations?
I think when it comes to school negotiations in a large setting where they might not have the individual attention, to the extent that you can place the focus with the individual classroom teacher in a collaborative problem-solving kind of way, the further you will get, as opposed to doing large committee meetings or meetings with the principal or meetings with the special services director. If you can approach the teacher and say, I'd like to talk to you about my child. I'd like to share with you what I know to be true about him or her and the struggles that she has in school. And clarifying from the beginning that this is not a blame game. I'm not saying that the school is causing these problems. I'm simply saying, I know this child well, and I want to share this with you. And then note the specific things that are most important for you to share about the learning difference and executive function. And once you do that, then also have a list of things that you really believe would be helpful. Some of what you'll hear tonight, some of what you may hear in sessions with a counselor, some of what may have been recommended through other testing that you've had done. And say, these are some recommended accommodations. Let's look at these together. What do you think is reasonable for us to do together? What can I do at home? What do you need? What can you do here and partner together? And generally speaking, if you approach educational folks that way, we become very willing to help and to partner with you and to try. We may not be able to do everything on your list, but we'll certainly try to do some of the things that we think might be most beneficial. And then I never recommend having a meeting like that and then waiting 6 months while your anger builds and then going in one day when you've kind of lost control of yourself and saying some things that might not be so helpful and creating an adversarial relationship. As soon as it's not working, as soon as it's not happening, if that's the third day after you had the meeting, talk again, ask again. Just reminding, we talked about this and I'm not seeing it, how can I support you? And the more frequently you're in communication in a rational, collaborative way, the more likely you are to get the supports that you need.
Yeah, how active were you with your child in the education process?
I would say that it's very important to, at the very beginning of the year, again, before there are problems, sit down with every teacher and say, this is how my child learns. These are the issues that he struggles with. This is the kind of help that he's going to need. And then it's critical to get the teacher to commit that as soon as something goes wrong, that first assignment not turned in, that they will communicate with you. One of my greatest frustrations had been that the teacher would call me several weeks later, and now there is this much homework that's missing. This kid couldn't do one. How is he going to do this many? And now he has 2 weeks to get caught up. That was probably the most vicious cycle that we had run into all the time. And and it is really up to the teacher. It happened, there was one particular year that no matter what I did, I could have walked on my eyelashes. The teacher just, so I went every week and I said, okay, at the end of the week, on Friday, you and I are going to sit down. And she finally did agree to that. If you're lucky, or if you are this kind of dedicated teacher that is always on top of it, it's wonderful. I was at the school a lot. I remember one teacher saying to me, Mrs. Ashkar, you're doing very well in the 4th grade. But it really is critical. You can't let the kid get behind. It's so difficult for them to get caught up.
Dr. Manos, when it comes to parental involvement in helping shape a child's behavior, I guess, I'm not sure if that's a proper term or not, but
It's a good one.
okay. Can parents help shape a child's behavior to come up with these skills? Or a lot of parents feel the guilt too. Well, I screwed up my kid because I didn't do this when he was 2 years old, and I let him watch 3 hours of TV or whatever it was. And now he's like this, or she's like this. How much is the parent's role there, and can parents have an active role in helping, for lack of a better term, fix issues that are there?
Well, every parent in the room knows the answer to that question. But more importantly, I had a mom from Singapore, and we did the evaluation. And when I told her what was going on, she said, it's my fault, isn't it? And I listened to her a little bit more. She drank 1 glass of wine in the 2nd month of her pregnancy. And her child was now 9 years old and hyperactive as the day is long. And she blamed herself, that child's entire life, for drinking that glass of wine and turning her child into this hyperactive child. Now, the point you're making is an incredibly important one. Because what you have to get about ADHD is that you don't fix the brain. Brains change, they're highly plastic, and they do change over time. For example, hyperactivity, impulsivity, tone down, starting about age 11 years old. So a parent of a 4-year-old only has 7 years to wait before things start to improve. But there's something more critical than all of that, and that is you all in this room, and there's one thing that has you sitting here. It's the commitment to your child or the children that you work with. That commitment means that you are a change agent. Parents and teachers are the primary change agents. Whose behavior has to change? The child's behavior? No. The parent behavior and the teacher behavior has to change. You can't count on a child behavior changing, but you can count on that when a teacher or parent does something differently, the child, him or herself, will adapt to the parent or to the teacher. All of our focus in our center is about training parents and training teachers and opening up new avenues of action for parents and teachers. Now, a lot of parents then say, well, that means my child's going to live with me when he's 30 years old and still be home and still be dependent on me. And people start creating a future that wasn't going to happen or hasn't happened yet. So one has to get that by taking action in the physical world, it's incredibly important. And one last thing about all of this, you can't get tired of it. So there's a kind of a koan, and it goes like this. Having a child with ADHD is like climbing a mountain that doesn't have a summit. You never, ever get to the top. You have one choice. That's to fall in love with climbing.
Michael, obviously, you've been through this. What specifically were you able to do to help yourself not forget to turn in assignments, to make sure you had your books for class, to be able to get things done?
Really, it boiled down to getting good habits. And growing up, a lot of people, whether it was teachers or my mom, my dad, friends, I had a million habits thrown at me. Oh, you should do this, you should do this. And while they were all good habits, when I have to remember 30 habits, it's no easier than remembering to do 30 things.
Yeah.
So really, the one habit I got into that I think has helped the most with organization is making a list and checking it. And what I'll do to this day, I'll make a list over the weekend, usually Sunday night, of all the assignments I have due for that week. I'll break it down by subjects. I'll say, I'm taking a supervision class right now. Supervision, this is what I have due each day, and I list them in order of the due date. I put the due date on it, and I have a section for other, and if it's not quite school-related or not class-related, I put something there. That I do once a week. Other than that, I remember every day one thing, check the list. You know, it became such a hassle. Oh, well, I have 5 classes. I have to check this syllabus. I have no idea where that other syllabus is. And it was just hard to do. And by creating the list, I keep my syllabi in one place, and I take them out once a week and put them back. When I carried them with me, you know, 2 years later, I'd find the syllabus from one class and couldn't find it during the semester. But so really, there's that, and just, I mean, what it really does come down to is one, not having a negative attitude. You know, it's very easy to say, oh, well, you know, it takes them, you know, half an hour to do that assignment, but I can't stay focused on it, so it takes me an hour or 40 minutes. Well, so I'm not going to do that, or I'll just work for the same amount of time that they work. But I've learned that, you know, that's not the case for me. You know, if it was basketball, it's gonna take a lot more practice for someone who's 5'5" to dunk, if they're ever able to, than it is for someone who's 6'8". But if they want to play basketball, they have to make the commitment to practice harder. And with me, I know that assignments are going to take me longer, and I have to be willing to put in the effort. And if that means maybe, not being able to plan as far ahead, I can't always say to a friend, okay, yeah, we'll go out Thursday night, and I'll just do my homework when I get back, because I may not be able to fit in all the homework if I get back at 11 o'clock. So kind of playing things by ear and really focusing on what's important and making sure that that comes first.
How long did it take you to actually get the habit of checking the list? And once you were really good at it, how long did it take maybe from when you started thinking about it?
A couple years. I really started at my freshman year of college, and it became a bit of a chore, but it was something I knew I had to do. And I think junior year, it's automatic. So, when I think of Sunday, I have, okay, so if I'm figuring out what I'm going to do Sunday, I have to make the list and then whatever else I'm doing. But it's gotten to the point where, making the list of what I have that week is synonymous with the word Sunday. And like anything, you do it enough, it becomes second nature to you.
We're going to be getting to the questions in just a second, so Steph, if you want to come down, we can
I just
do
add
that.
something
Feel free
about
while we're doing that,
homework?
yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I think was already mentioned, but I think it's good to really grasp it, is that it's very important to understand how your child learns. My son, for example, is very visual. And so the way that he used to be able to focus better on what needs to get done is that he used to lay it all out on the kitchen table. Now, he couldn't get it all done in one fell swoop. So we would say, okay, work on this. And then after that, he really liked taking really active breaks, like basketball. We had a trampoline that had a great workout. And he would do that and burn off some energy. Then he could come back and work on the next thing. And it really used to annoy him to have all that stuff on the table. So he liked getting it done and putting it away. Then he'd get the next thing done and put that away. So his goal was to have the table clear. And it kind of that ties in with this is to not have other distractions. I think that tip is in this booklet, and it's critical. And for those of you who are teachers and you have a child in the classroom who has difficulty focusing, take a look at what's around in your classroom. I used to walk into some classrooms and I'd be choked, and I don't have attention issues. There are multiplication tables and geography and maps and flowers and things, just stuff everywhere. I didn't know where to look. My kid had no clue where to look, and he was looking everywhere except at the teacher. And so I think that the more you can keep the classroom clear, the more you can get that kid to focus on the teacher, and don't put them in the back row because they are fidgety. Put them in the front row because you'll be able to really see what they're getting and what they're not getting out of that classroom.
Thank you all for the questions, by the way. We got a ton of questions. We got about 40 minutes. We're going to try and get through as many as we can. If you don't get your question answered tonight, feel free to go to yourteenmag.com, which of course is the magazine that's published through Steph and Sue in the back there, who helped organize this as well. Great resource. If you're not a subscriber already, I highly suggest it. Some great tips and resources there. And you can also direct some questions to them, and they can possibly bring it up in a future issue, or maybe direct it to some of our panelists as well. First one, and try and jump in as you can on this, but we'll try to keep your answers short if you can. How is a lack of directed attention, I think Dr. Manos talked about this, different than just typical procrastination in tweens and teenagers?
Well, functionally, it's not different. Procrastination is procrastinating. But you always have to ask yourself, what makes a person procrastinate? And the level of effort it takes to use directed attention is typically what makes the person with ADHD procrastinate. In a typical person who can use directed attention more easily, it's not as painful to use directed attention. So essentially, procrastination is putting off some painful experience.
I think this would be for Jason. My son's school does not believe he is eligible for a 504 or IEP because he is passing his classes. Some grades are D's, others are A's. How can I convince them that he does need a 504 or an IEP? I feel that they just pass him just to get him on to the next grade.
This is a very difficult process, as many of you shaking your heads I see may know. And often the qualification for an IEP or a 504 rests on whether or not the child is failing in wherever they are. And I mean legitimately failing, not performing poorly, but the Fs are showing up on the report card before they will then be considered qualified, essentially, for additional services. It's somewhat less difficult to get a 504, particularly for ADHD, than it is to get an IEP, but that depends on the school district. What I can tell you is that if your district, is refusing, you can be kind of limited in your options. You can always seek additional testing by a psychologist at any of the hospitals locally or agencies that do that. You can share that testing with the district. Some will work with you on that, some will not. I wish I had a rosier picture on that.
How do you differentiate executive functioning problems in ADHD when there's also defiance or noncompliance in trying to help out a person or offer an intervention?
I think, first of all, a good evaluation of executive functioning skills is necessary. And a lot of times I will have parents say, my child's just not doing this because they're defiant. And what we find in testing is they're not doing it because of lack of initiation or lack of appropriate problem-solving skills. So in general, what I do is help the family and parents to come up with interventions, and we try to put those interventions in place. So let's try to set up the skills. Let's try to break the task down. Let's try to come up with our organizational scheme that will work for the child. If the child is just flat out refusing, then you can address the noncompliance in terms of more of a therapeutic setting. But usually I break down the skills and say, what are we missing here and what can we teach the child? Because remember, teaching executive functioning skills are like teaching any other academic skill. You just break it down and specifically teach it. So I usually look at it first as, what's going on here? Let's take a step back and say, there probably is an issue here that's leading to the noncompliance, so let's try to address the skill weakness first.
I think sometimes the noncompliance is because exactly the child doesn't know what to do.
Right.
And one thing to really keep in mind is that this behavior it's not willful. They don't want to be failing. They don't want to be struggling. And when they do, the issue of self-esteem also comes into play. So if you can teach them those skills and help them to cope and help them to accomplish some things where they really feel accomplished. I did it. I can do it. I can do it again. That self-esteem is going to start rising, and they will be more willing to do things.
But the child, I think it's very important that the child buys into and is part of your organizational intervention. So what works for you may not work for your child. So I know this sounds simplistic, but it's not done very often. Ask your child, does this work for you? There's not a kind of one-size-fits-all when you're coming up with interventions for executive functioning weakness. So I think that's very important, especially when you hit adolescence. They really need to buy into it. And, if they say to you, the way to remember where my notebook is stick it next to the cereal box in the morning, put their notebook next to the cereal box in the morning. I'm okay with that. Whatever works and whatever's going to help the child.
Are school psychologists familiar with executive functioning? Will they understand what I'm referring to when I approach them and say, hey, my child needs help with executive functioning? Is that something that school psychologists are familiar with? Are either of you work with schools? Do you work with schools?
Very intensely. Okay. I'll answer it and then you can probably jump into. I think probably 20 years ago when we first started this, I would say school psychologists were not as familiar, but I think having wonderful talks like this, and I think executive functioning weaknesses and executive functioning in general is becoming a hot topic. I think school psychologists are much more educated in this area, and I find that they're referring more often for additional assistance. But I think that often we need to break it down. So just going to the school and saying, my child has ADHD with related executive functioning weaknesses isn't very helpful. We need to break down exactly what those are.
And once you find out what those are, then you can model the environment around the child to assist it. So a child who has poor working memory, That's the working memory is the scratch pad of the brain. It's like you write a note, so your spouse tells you, go to the store and get these 5 things. Well, usually people aren't going to remember between home and the store the 5 things. So they write it down. Well, that's modifying the environment. It's what I was saying before as change agents. We not only change the environment to work for the child, but we then ultimately teach children to modify their own environments. Michael here is describing exactly that. And once you know what executive function is being problematic, then you design an environment that makes it non-problematic.
Michael, I'd like to direct this question to you. It says, how do you deal with your child when the frustration level causes them to simply shut down? I'd like to hear your reverse perspective on this. How did you want your parents to react when you were just, I can't take it anymore? You know, what did you want them to do, and maybe what should parents do in that situation?
Well, I can't speak from a parent's point of view, but I gather, I'm sure it's very frustrating. They want to help, but in the situation you just said, their child has shut down, so there's a feeling of helplessness. What do I do to get my child? I can't physically take their hand and write the answers and make them work. And from the child's point of view, it's the same thing. I mean, figure as much frustration as there is outside, for the child, they're the one there who can't do it. And what I found really worked is a lot of times when I would shut down, I have experienced that it's because I was overwhelmed, whether it was because I got behind and I had a lot of work to catch up on, or the thing I was trying to do was a complicated thing and the instructions, say, were half a page. I didn't know what to start with. I got overwhelmed and I just, panicked and shut down. And for me, what I found helped is if somebody would break it down and they would say, okay, well, they're asking you to write a paper that includes, these 9 things. Well, I would look at it and say, okay, 9 things, I can think of one, but how do I incorporate all 9? And, then you say, okay, well, think about what you have to do. You have to write a paper. So you need an introduction, and then you need each of your 9 things. So if you approach them one at a time and say, okay, I have to do this one thing. Ignore the other 9. You write that one. Then the next one, you say, okay, I have to write this one thing. And you go down, and all you need is a conclusion to tie the 9 together. But by breaking down something that is overwhelming, it's not overwhelming anymore. At least that's what I've found.
Where can I find an organizational coach for my teenager? Do they exist? Are there places you can go to do that? Anybody?
It's called a mom.
It's called a mom.
The chad.org is a great website to go to, and there's a link to coaches. And if you Google coaches, ADHD coaches, you'll come up with all kinds of things.
Yeah, there's a few in there.
It was Chad, C-H-A-D?
CHADD. It
2
stands
Ds.
for children and adults with attention deficit disorder. I know that doesn't come out to Chad, but it's chadd.org.
I think just to add to that, I think, and you brought that up very clearly, in addition to looking for an organizational coach, I think as parents, you can serve as that organizational coach for your child, and I think that's exactly what you're saying. I've found that with my patients and my kids that it's been so helpful when the parent does exactly what you say. Let's break this down. Instead of getting frustrated, I'm going to help you stop and plan. And I always teach my parents the 4 kind of things to remember in terms of problem solving, exactly what you're saying. Goal, what's your goal? Plan, do, review. If you can teach your kids that and model that for them, you're going to see the level of frustration decrease on both ends.
Can I add one thing? Because it's what Dr. Berry said before. A child or an adolescent, even adult, has to be enrolled in the coaching process. You can provide the greatest coach in the world, and if a child is not willing to be coached, then nothing will happen.
Is there a point as parents when there's a fine line between, in my mind, enabling and helping? Where do you draw that line? Where do you say, you know what, I've helped you so much, you should be able to do this now? You know, do you continue to break it down, like you said, climbing that mountain for the rest of your life? Or is there a point where you've given them what they can and they should be able to do it by now?
Can I
Yeah.
I'd like to weigh in on that because it's the biggest concern parents have. Am I enabling my child? Parents have to let go of that notion. Do you know something interesting happens in adolescence? Teenagers end up individuating. They want to be separate from you. They don't want to live with you when they're 30. They do want to live their own life. And so the fear that by being a change agent, by structuring an environment and gradually transferring to the child how to structure their own environment, for example, by making requests, for example, by all the things that Lawrence School teaches. When you do that, you are giving skills that the child will use on their own. Individuation takes place all by itself. So the fear that you're enabling your child is one to be wary of, but not one to be dominated by. Continue to do that. Children with ADHD tend to mature more gradually than other children. There's an acceleration of brain development in the late teens. And so what wasn't there at the age of 13, 14, or 15 will be there later. Don't create a future that hasn't happened.
You speak about the positives and negatives of medication. Is it a short-term solution that in the long run prevents a child from developing real strategies? Is there any correlation between early medication and later drug and alcohol dependence or other negative long-term effects?
Do you want to start?
I can start.
Go ahead.
The answer to the last part of the question is an absolute no. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. Children, in a very well-publicized study in 2000, and then another study that just occurred last year, Tim Willens at Harvard and the Harvard group published analysis of kids who ended up being substance abusers and substance users. What was very interesting is that there were three groups of kids: typical kids, kids with ADHD who were treated with medicine, and kids with ADHD who were not treated with medicine. The incidence of substance use disorder in late teens and early adulthood, after following this group of kids for about 10 years, the typical kids showed 11% substance use disorder. The kids with ADHD who were treated with medicine showed 13% substance use disorder, so about equal to the typical kids. The kids with ADHD who were not treated at all showed 39%, 3 times the amount substance use disorder. So there appears to be a prophylactic effect. And there are other benefits of medicine that far outweigh the detriment. Now, please listen. We have a very strong behavioral program as well, and I'm not, I just want to bring some reality to the issue of medicine, because there's a lot of disinformation.
I think that the issue also is the impulse control, and that is the one thing that the medication seems to be really helpful with. And so I think that the kids who are not on medication, they're going to feed those impulses, whereas a child who is on medication is going to have an easier time in dealing with it. My son has been both on medication. I mean, he was diagnosed when he was in kindergarten. So in the beginning, he was on medication. For a while, then he wasn't. And actually, my son did go to Lawrence, to the upper school, and it did wonders for him and our family. During those years in the beginning, he was not on medication, but as the work got more involved and he got more involved in activities and there were more things to juggle, I think the last year he was back on medication. And now in college, he is on medication.
Just to add, I think, again, having a thorough evaluation is extremely important. And I always, when I talk to my families, and if we diagnose a child with ADHD, I always question, is this interfering with learning? Is it interfering with your child's self-esteem? And is it interfering with social functioning? Those are some of the important questions we ask before we decide whether or not we're going to do a trial on medication. And like Michael already said, it's a combined approach. It's medication. If we do medication in addition to behavioral intervention, in addition to academic intervention, and then intervention for self-esteem. So it always has to be a combined approach. Some children need medication to function, just like if you had a child with diabetes, you would clearly treat them. Other children don't, and it really is dependent on the child. I think it's dependent on the severity of the ADHD and how it impacts everyday functioning.
Michael, I'm not sure on your situation. If you want to speak on it, you can. I don't know if you had taken any medication or not, and did that help you?
I have been on medicine in the past. I'm currently not on medicine. But I will say, I mean, when I was first on medicine, there was a lot of, well, you know, other people I know aren't on medicine, and it kind of felt like one more thing that made me different. You know, I have the ADHD, that makes me different. Now I'm on medication. But, you know, like the other panelists have said, if you're on diabetes, it's, you know, having ADHD isn't something that you did. It's something, it's an imbalance in chemicals in your brain. That's the way your brain functions. So just like, you know, if your body doesn't produce enough calcium, you might take a calcium supplement. It's balancing out, and I mean, I can tell you from my experience, the medication did help. I was on Adderall for a while, and when I was on it, it was really the only time in my life where I truly had very good focus.
Is an ADHD kid more likely to be a target of bullying? What can a parent do? Jason, have you seen things of this?
I think any student with a learning difference that stands out, that makes a student in any way different from what might be considered to be the norm, can lead to bullying behavior. And sometimes because students who have difficulties with impulse control that are part of ADHD will say things and do things and be intrusive in ways that they don't intend to be hurtful, but are off-putting to their peers, they can be more frequently victimized than peers who don't engage in that way.
Do you think a child needs to know their diagnosis? Or do you think said child needs only be aware of their challenges and learn effective strategies? My oldest was just recently diagnosed with Asperger's, so I'm dealing with this right now. We don't know whether to tell him. He knows he's had issues for years, and I'm sure parents, you've dealt with this as well. And then how do you tell the rest of the family too? How do you tell the siblings, hey, your brother, your sister has this, I know things aren't fair at the house, how do you deal with that? And should you reveal that, or should you just kind of help them?
I'll go ahead and start. I think that when the child asks a question, then you answer it. So I actually work with parents with children with Asperger's pretty intensely, and that's a question that's brought up very often. And what I say to the families is, some families are very, very against using the A word. They just don't want to do that. I'm very open and honest, and I say it is what it is. It's Asperger's, and Asperger's is a different way of thinking about things. It's kind of a social learning difference, like dyslexia is a reading disability. ADHD, you have difficulty focusing, you have difficulty putting those blinders on. This is what it means, and here's how we're going to deal with it. It's not used as an excuse. I think the more knowledge we provide our children with, the more they know about themselves, the better they're able to self-advocate for themselves. And there's a lot of wonderful books out there on what it's like to have ADHD, what it's like to have Asperger's, what it's like to have learning differences. I find that knowledge is very powerful for children.
I think it was very helpful for my son to know that he has ADHD, and because so many of the kids are made to feel different, and even sometimes made to feel dumb, he was very much relieved, and it added some normalcy. And he said, there are so many other children who have this issue, and they also differ, and here's how we're going to work on it. And he felt normal. He really did. which is interesting because some people may worry that saying that you have this will make you feel not normal. For us, actually, it brought a certain level of normalcy. Okay, I'm not just weird.
And I always present it in terms of start with your child's strengths. Here's what you do really well. This is what you're really, really good at. Look how well you do this, and you can help your brother and sister out in math. This is a little more difficult for you. Everyone has learning differences, and that's kind of how I work with the kids.
Did you know when you were diagnosed?
Yes, I did. I've actually been very involved in my diagnosis from the beginning. That maybe because my mom's a psychologist and wasn't given as much of an option. But I agree with the way it was done, and I agree with what they've said. Because while, from your point of view, your child having ADHD is something that you need to accept, ultimately, in the long run, they're the one who has ADHD, and they're the one who needs to accept it. And I think because they're the ones struggling with it, it's easier if they know what's going on. If they know really what they're struggling with and say how it works, they can give better insight on how to deal with it. They know what they're thinking. It affects everybody a little differently. They know what works for them, whether it's putting the binder in the kitchen, or for me, I wall and stuff, I keep in my shoe at night. Toss me my shoe, because I'm not going anywhere without my shoes. So, little things that they'll know more than a parent would or an outsider would. So the more they're aware of what they have and how it works, the better it's going to be able to be managed.
What's the best way to have a child evaluated when your child is not necessarily diagnosed as a textbook ADHD, but does struggle with things like retention, organization, tests, language, etc.?
In our clinic, there are some fundamental practices. So, first of all, you always use rating scales. So we use a broadband scale, which covers a whole variety of things, and a narrowband scale, which covers just ADHD, and then different versions of each of those. Then a very well-conducted, semi-structured interview. It takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours, and you look at all facets of the child's life, from social network to parenting, parent behavior management in the home, to routine of the day, to various personological characteristics about the child. You have to do an interview. There is no single test for ADHD. Then, psychological testing. Primarily, a useful test to use would be an intelligence test that looks at verbal abilities, nonverbal abilities, and a composite, and then perhaps some measure of working memory. But here's the other very key thing. You don't stop just with doing that. You have to get somebody else who knows the child well, and usually that's the teacher, to fill out rating scales themselves. Don't trust only what parents say. Don't trust only what teachers say. Then, when you bring all of this information together, and that includes a semi-structured interview with the child, then you know what you're dealing with. So ADHD is a clustering of characteristics. It's not a single thing like being disorganized. It's a clustering of a number of different characteristics. In fact, there are 18 different ones. You have to be able to determine, are these things there, first of all? Are these things posing a problem, second of all? And are these things posing a problem across at least 2 settings, usually home and school? That's the process. There is no single test. You will be sold this or that or the other thing. There is no single test.
I have a special class, I assume this is from a teacher, that have many children with ADHD in it. How should I specifically be teaching differently?
There are many strategies that can be helpful. First and foremost, as Lee said earlier, remove the distractions from the room so you are the most entertaining thing in the room. If you're not, then they'll find something else. Stand up and circulate. through the classroom. Don't sit at your desk. The more you move, the more you're in motion, the faster you can make physical contact, obviously gently and appropriately with a student, the faster you can tap on somebody's desk to bring them back on task, that you can point to a page or help them follow along, the more quickly you're going to move the lesson. Often folks will slow down. Well, because they're having such trouble with the organization and the executive function, I'll slow down. Speed up. Okay, the ADHD mind is running so fast in so many different directions that you need to change. Change the topic, change the instructional strategy, change the color of the screen on the smartboard, anything. But keep moving, keep changing the thing so that that mind that's moving so fast is directed toward what you're doing. And it's exhausting. It is exhausting to do that and do it well day in and day out, but those are some of the strategies that will help.
My 6th grade daughter is everything you have described as executive functioning disorder. She's doing fine in school, but her conferences have been the same since kindergarten. Very sweet, very outgoing, but socializes too much, too distracted. So what's the first step for this parent in getting that help?
I think, first of all, talking to the teachers about what else they can do. So if she's distracted, I guess I would want to know, what does that mean? Does that mean she can't complete tasks? Once again, just like we're talking with the children, breaking it down, we need to have the teachers break it down and the parents break it down. So distracted means what? If I hear distracted means she's unable to complete tasks because she can't focus, then again, that's our problem area. So then we might talk to the teacher about ways to get her to focus. Do we need to highlight directions on her test? Do we need to do some color blocking? Do we need to make more use of technology? I'd probably try some interventions with her first before going for an evaluation.
How do you convince an ADHD person the importance of keeping an item in one place, rather than finding a better place to put it all the time, and then you never know where it goes? And I'll direct this to you, Michael.
Pray.
Partially, again, it's a habit. For example, I always keep my wallet together. I always keep my keys together. I always keep my watch together. But it does come down to choosing a place for something and making sure that, it sounds oversimplified, but making sure that you put it there every time. Like my binders for school. I have a little 1-inch binder for each subject, and in it I have different sections. I have papers, homework, notes, handouts, because there was a time in my life where every paper I got folded and stuck in one folder in my backpack. And then every time I went to get something out, I dumped out 40 sheets of paper and said, don't need that, don't need that. And so really it does come down to just, knowing, okay, my jacket goes on the hook in the front closet or wherever, and then sticking to that. And you'll catch yourself. You say, my jacket's now on the kitchen table, so go put it on the hook. And it's certainly easier said than done, but again, the more you work at it,
Yeah, and again, I think you should pick your battles. Some things, it doesn't matter. We've been looking for stuff since the kid was 5 years old, and so when it came to schoolwork, we did a lot of what Michael just said, folders and trying to get him to have a routine that would be helpful. Coats, we come in through the garage, there's a coat closet right there. Never on the dining room table, on the kitchen table, a lot of times on the floor. I ended up buying a coat tree, actually, that's right by the door, because it's easier for my son to just go, whoop, than to open the closet, take out a hanger, and put the thing in. It was never going to happen. So there are some simple things that you can do to help. Watch how your child behaves and say, okay, I can slip that coat tree over there, and then he'll do that. And I can do this, and he'll do that. A hamper. His clothes never made it to the hamper in the kid's bathroom. I got a hamper for his room. At least half the clothes may get into the hamper. But really pick your battles.
What if you take your child for testing outside of the school? How does the school respond to outside testing versus testing that's done within the school?
That varies substantially district to district. Each district will have their own procedures in terms of whether or not they'll validate that testing. At least that's been my experience.
If the school is less supportive, how do you make sure that you get the expert's opinion in there?
You can always share what you have with the district. You can ask for them to respond to you, to share with you at least that they've read it and understand it. But as I say, whether they validate it and utilize it is a district-by-district decision.
I'm a teacher who feels frustrated when parents don't want to give their children ADHD medication. Now, I'm not sure if that's want to get them prescribed for it or actually give them their pills on a daily basis, but how do you guys deal with that issue? Is the teacher's input that much for the parents to really say, you know what, maybe we need to look? Obviously, it's up to the parents ultimately, you know, what they want to do.
We really work hard from the school perspective to stay out of the discussion between parents and their children about medication. We really have a neither pro nor con medication. It's whatever works for each child. And in my opinion, it's really not a teacher's role to get into recommendations about medication. To the extent that you can, making the accommodations that we talked about in your classroom, restructuring some of the things that you're doing. Teachers can get into difficult places if they're talking about medication recommendations.
Essentially, the decision to use medicine is solely the parents.
But I think the teacher can recommend, though, that further testing might be beneficial. And I think that's always very helpful. The teacher may say things like, gosh, I think your child's really having difficulty focusing or difficulty reading. You might want to pursue a further evaluation. I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, I think that's a key. If the teacher can highlight what exactly isn't working, and then look at what are the different avenues that we could pursue to try to make that easier and better.
Any good resources you recommend for teachers or school psychologists to use to help with executive functioning skills?
There's several books out there by Pam Dawson, and there's a couple out there. I think one's called Lost, Unprepared, and Disorganized. In fact, what we can do is maybe come up with a resource list, and maybe they can put it on the website, if you guys, on your website.
We'll definitely talk to Stephanie and Sue to do that.
Because I have multiple books and references that I could include.
And again, that website, by the way, is yourteenmag.com. It's at the bottom of your program, highlighted next to the blue about lingering questions, so if you need that, if you didn't get a chance to write it down. My daughter's on a 504, is not failing. I don't notice any change in the teacher comments or her achievement. So what's the next step, though? Do I have her tested for ADHD? Does the student have to be diagnosed to get an IEP and get special accommodations, special services?
Generally speaking, the 504 will get you the accommodations that you're requesting in terms of whatever the deficit is. If it's ADHD, then there are certain accommodations that you can get. If you're wanting additional service, then you do need to qualify for the IEP, which requires, real difficulty, much more extensive difficulty in school, evidence of particular interventions that haven't been successful, testing that indicates a discrepancy in certain areas, those kinds of things. So you can certainly request additional testing and information. Again, it will be a district factor as to whether or not they'll follow through on those recommendations.
We're going to wrap up. We're getting close to the end, and I want to give the panelists at least one more chance to kind of sum up what they've heard tonight, and I want to get to one more question if I can right now. What do you do when your child will not accept your coaching, no matter how involved and supportive you have been?
Maybe look at how you're approaching your child and try to approach it from a different way. And then sometimes, especially if you have an adolescent, it might be beneficial to seek an outside coach also. Maybe ask a teacher or get another tutor.
Once again, I want to thank Tree of Knowledge for sponsoring tonight's panel. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to do this. So make sure that you check out them if you need any services. They have a great array of things that can help out you and your child. I want to run down the panel one more time and just kind of sum up what you've heard tonight, maybe some of the things that you want to get out, just a couple of minutes per person. Dr. Berry.
Okay. I think most importantly, identify your child's strengths and weaknesses, help them to understand their strengths and weaknesses, come up with a plan to help address those weaknesses in addition to build up their strengths. And I think as parents and teachers, be good role models for your child. So if your child has executive functioning weaknesses, you need to teach them and show them how to be organized. You need to teach them and show them how to problem solve. You need to encourage them and support them.
Dr.
A real critical factor is acceptance of the child as the child is, acceptance of the teenager as the teenager is, acceptance of adults as they are. And if you accept that and you don't make the person wrong, there's only one thing left to do. Change the world around. The ADHD brain is highly attuned to the physical world. When things change in the physical world, then, and if you've heard all of the recommendations discussed tonight, they didn't involve focusing on the child and changing the child. They involved changing what the child does or changing the things that happen around the child. Everything that Michael has described, for example, is his acting on the world around him, not trying to fix himself. And if there's one thing to keep in mind, or actually two things, it's acceptance and work on the world around the person and teach the person to work on that world.
You know, I called my son yesterday and I said, so, you know, this is what I'm doing, and what do you think is the most important thing, particularly looking at if you have a teenager that has these issues and now they're transitioning to college. So they were at home or at a school that was supportive, and you helped them with getting themselves organized, and now they are going to go off on their own. And he said a couple things. He said the most important thing is self-esteem. And I think it goes along with what you're saying too, and what I think what all of us have said, that he said, first of all, I need to know that I can do this. And having done it, if we've developed these habits over a long period of time, that's what they are now. They are habits. And I believe that I can do it because I did it. I did it, and the environment that the child is in needs to be accepting and supportive, and you know, and self-esteem can get that child to be really, really successful, because first they have to believe that they can do it.
There was a question earlier about whether or not to share a diagnosis with a child, and whether you share the actual title of the diagnosis or not. The demystification process for kids is one of the most important things. And to simply say to a child, these are the things that you struggle with, and there's a name for it, and there's a reason for it. It's not you being broken or you being a problem. It's simply the way that you are and the way that you're wired. Makes a huge difference for kids. You'll see them physically relax. And one of the first things we hear as students begin to go through that process of demystification is that there are others just like me who have these same kinds of issues, and we all struggle in the same way, and there's a reason for it. Makes a difference in the trajectory that they follow. We find that kids who don't know or haven't been as accepting of that information struggle more than those who know and can talk about it openly. And when you talk about it openly, you then become able to advocate to get your needs met, whether in high school, in the college setting, in your workplace, or whatever it is. You become comfortable with who you are and what you need.
I guess the most important thing I can say really is that things do get better. I'm not saying they're going to be easy. I'm not saying the problems are going to go away completely, but they do get better. Like Lee just said, the longer you do things, the more they become habits. And the more things that you do to compensate for ADHD that become habits, the less conscious effort they're going to take to do, and the easier that particular thing is going to get. Also, I mean, if you look in the long run, I mean, college, for example, we've all spoken about how people with ADHD have an easier time doing something that they're interested in. Well, in elementary school and high school, you're going to take a social studies class, you're going to take an English class, a math class. You may not have interest in any class but English. When you're in college or in the real world, you can choose something that focuses on English. So as things progress, you can choose what interests you and what's going to be easier for you due to that interest. And I mean, that really, like I said, just lists and habits and continuing to believe in yourself and not give up and say, well, it's harder for me, what's the point? Because you can't get through it.
How about a round of applause for our
One more
panelists?
note for teachers.
Sure.
Sorry. See, my mind works like that too. One more note for teachers. When I suppose any kid, when they ask you to explain something again because they didn't get it, really find a different way of explaining it than you did the first time. And I find that this was often the problem with my son, where he didn't get it the first time. Repeating it 5 more times the same way didn't help him. He still didn't get it. He heard it, he just didn't get it. So again, it's a challenge. As Jason had said, it's a very difficult job. But every time, try to think of a different way of covering the same information. Sorry.
Thank you to the teachers. Thank you to the parents. Before we go, Sue Borson from Your Teen Magazine would like to say just a few words.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. First of all, I want to thank the Tree of Knowledge. They were tremendous partners, and we were so pleased to have this experience with them. And then I would, of course, like to thank the very talented and sharing and knowledgeable and generous panelists. We thank you to Dr. Berry, Dr. Manos, Lee Ackhart, Jason Culp, and Michael Kaplan, and of course to Todd Meany. I want to thank all of you for coming. For me, the evening was so meaningful. I actually felt myself well up with a number of comments, and it will change me as a parent. I hope it will change all of you as parents, teachers involved with kids. Thank you.